Have you ever wondered when the roots of conflict between America and Russia were planted? This question takes us back to the tumultuous times of the early 20th century, specifically to the Russian Revolution of 1917. As Russia was engulfed in the flames of revolution, the United States, concerned by the rise of Bolshevism, decided to intervene on the side of the anti-Bolsheviks. This act, seen by many as an intrusion into Russia's internal affairs, was the initial spark that ignited a long-lasting discord between the two nations. Despite the end of the revolution and the birth of the Soviet Union, America continued to hold on to its reservations. It wasn't until 16 years later, in 1933, that the United States officially recognized the Soviet Union. These early instances of ideological clashes and diplomatic standoffs were the seeds from which a much larger conflict would grow. And from these early seeds of discord, the stage was set for a conflict that would span decades. As World War II ended, a new war was just beginning, a Cold War. This was a war not fought with guns and bombs, but with ideas and ideologies, a war that shaped the world as we know it today. At the heart of this conflict lay fundamental ideological differences. The United States, a beacon of capitalism and democracy, was pitted against the Soviet Union, a stronghold of communism and totalitarianism. These opposing systems of thought led to an intense rivalry, each side vying for global dominance. The first major flashpoint came in 1948 with the Berlin blockade. The Soviet Union attempted to starve West Berlin into submission, cutting off all land access to the city. But the United States and its allies didn't buckle. They organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city with essential goods by air for almost a year until the Soviets finally lifted the blockade. This event further deepened the divide and led to the formation of two opposing military alliances. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established by the United States and its Western allies to counter Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviet Union formed its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, creating a clear line of division across the continent of Europe. But the Cold War was not just about military alliances. It was also an arms race, a competition to build the most powerful weapons. Both sides amassed vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, creating a balance of terror. This arms race was not just about physical power, but also about demonstrating technological superiority, a symbolic representation of the ideological struggle at the heart of the Cold War. With the world watching, tensions escalated, and the fear of nuclear war loomed. The world was perched on the edge of a precipice, looking into the abyss of a potential nuclear apocalypse. This was the beginning of the Cold War, a war of ideologies, a war of attrition, a war unlike any other that had come before it. While the Cold War was a time of tension, it wasn't without its moments of easing. In this complex web of international relations, there were periods where the world breathed a sigh of relief, where the tension was not as palpable. Take the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. It was one of the most nerve-wracking episodes where the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. But it also marked a significant thaw in the Cold War. The crisis ended with an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, where both sides agreed to dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba and Turkey, respectively. This resolution is often seen as a turning point, a moment where the two superpowers demonstrated their ability to negotiate and compromise to avert a global catastrophe. But as we delve further into the history, we find that this thaw was short-lived. The Cold War was a period of cyclical tensions, a pendulum swinging between moments of relative peace and times of heightened conflict. And the pendulum swung back to conflict with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979. The invasion marked a stark freeze in the relations between the two superpowers. It was a direct challenge to the détente, the easing of strained relations, that had been developing since the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The invasion was seen as an expansion of Soviet influence, a move that the United States could not ignore. It was a return to the familiar pattern of conflict of the two superpowers jockeying for global dominance. This cycle of thaw and freeze, of tension and temporary relief, characterized much of the Cold War. It was a dance between two superpowers, each step calculated, each move analyzed. And while there were moments where the music slowed, where the dance seemed less frantic, it never truly stopped. Even in moments of peace, the shadow of conflict was never far away. The Cold War was a complex era marked by a constant undercurrent of tension, even during its quieter moments. The thaw and the freeze were simply different chapters in the same unfolding story. As quickly as it had started, the Cold War came to an end. The end of the Cold War was not marked by a decisive battle, but by a series of events that gradually dissolved the tension between the two superpowers. A key figure in this process was Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev was a reformist leader, and he introduced two significant policies that would greatly influence the end of the Cold War: glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Glasnost allowed for a greater freedom of speech and transparency in government activities. This openness exposed the deep-seated corruption and inefficiencies of the Soviet system, leading to a crisis of confidence among its people. Perestroika, on the other hand, aimed to reform the Soviet Union's economy, which had been stifled under decades of state control. The policy sought to introduce market-like reforms, but instead it led to a deep economic crisis and widespread shortages. In the midst of these internal struggles, the symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, fell in November 1989. The wall's collapse was not planned or expected, but it was a direct result of the changing political climate. People celebrated as they crossed the border freely for the first time in nearly 30 years, and the event signified the beginning of the end for the Cold War. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in a state of political and economic collapse. In December of that year, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, marking the official dissolution of the Soviet Union. The end of the Cold War represented a seismic shift in global politics. The world had moved from a bipolar power structure to a unipolar one, dominated by the United States. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism seemed to have been won by the West. But even as the Cold War ended, a new era of conflict was on the horizon. This new era would be marked by different challenges and conflicts, but the legacy of the Cold War continues to shape our world today. The Cold War may have ended, but the conflict between America and Russia was far from over. As the dust of the Cold War settled, a new era dawned. However, it was not an era of unbroken peace. The relationship between America and Russia remained fraught with disagreements and conflicts, now playing out on different stages. One of the most significant sources of contention was the expansion of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. At the heart of the Cold War, NATO was an alliance of Western powers, led by the United States. After the Cold War, NATO membership expanded eastward, incorporating many former Soviet republics and Eastern Bloc countries. Russia viewed this as a threat, a Western encroachment on its sphere of influence. Simmering tensions broke into open conflict with the Kosovo War in the late 90s. As a province of Serbia, Kosovo was a part of the former Yugoslavia, an ally of Russia. The United States, leading a NATO intervention, sided with the ethnic Albanians of Kosovo seeking independence. Russia vehemently opposed this intervention, further straining relations. In the new millennium, conflicts in the Middle East have become another battleground for the two powers. The Syrian civil war, in particular, has seen America and Russia backing opposing sides. America supports the rebels seeking to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, while Russia backs the Assad regime. This has led to a complex and fraught situation, with both superpowers attempting to wield influence and protect their interests. These conflicts and disagreements are not simply isolated incidents. They are part of a broader narrative of a continued struggle for power and influence, a legacy of the Cold War. They represent the ongoing contest between two worldviews, two ideologies, and two ways of understanding and shaping the world. The 21st century has seen a continuation of this historic conflict, albeit in new forms and on new fronts. From the Russian Revolution to modern-day conflicts, the US-Russia relationship has been a complex and tense one. Indeed, this intricate dance of power and politics has ebbed and flowed over decades, shaping the global landscape in profound ways. We began our journey at the genesis of conflict, tracing the roots back to the Russian Revolution. From there, we dove into the icy waters of the Cold War, a time of espionage, proxy wars, and nuclear threats. We then explored the Thaw and Freeze periods, highlighting the fluctuating tensions between the two superpowers. The end of the Cold War brought a sense of relief, yet the post-Cold War era ushered in new conflicts, further complicating the relationship. Despite the shifts in the global political landscape, the US-Russia conflict has remained a constant, reminding us of its longevity and complexity. As we move forward, the history of these conflicts offers us lessons and cautionary tales for the future.